Before you settle into your bed tonight, I want you to do something simple but powerful. Turn off your lights and let the room fall into complete darkness. Take a moment to feel the quiet around you. Now, as you lie back, open your eyes and look into the black screen in front of you. Let it become a doorway into the unknown. In the stillness, you'll find a world waiting for you, a world where light is a distant memory and darkness holds the answers. Take a deep breath and let go of everything around you. You're about to step into a place where the only thing that matters is what you can't see. Look into the black screen. Let it consume you. Let it follow you into sleep. And remember, it's not just a screen. It's a doorway. Let's begin.
The French Quarter was alive with its usual nocturnal symphony, the distant wail of a saxophone drifting from a dimly lit bar, the clip-clop of a horse-drawn carriage echoing down another street, and the faint chatter of tourists marveling at the charm of the old city. But here, on Royal Street, the noise faded into an unnatural quiet. The air felt heavy, as if the very street held its breath. The fog was thicker than Charlie expected, swirling lazily around her ankles and clinging to the wrought iron fences. Gas lamps flickered weakly, their light swallowed by the mist, casting jagged shadows that seemed to shift and stretch unnaturally. The cobblestones beneath her boots were slick from the evening's earlier rain, and each step sent a sharp tap reverberating into the silence. Charlie paused under a street lamp, her breath curling in faint white puffs. She reached for her phone, its screen glowing faintly as she reviewed her notes. A quote she had jotted down earlier caught her eye. "The house doesn't just haunt you, it watches you. It waits." Her fingers tightened around the phone as she glanced up at her destination. The Lalaurie mansion loomed through the mist, a hulking silhouette that seemed to materialize rather than simply stand. Even from a distance, it exuded a palpable, oppressive energy. The pale gray walls were smooth and unblemished, defying the ravages of time, yet they seemed to shimmer faintly, as though breathing. This was it, the story that would define her podcast, Sleepy Tales. For years, Charlie had sought the strangest, darkest tales, chasing the supernatural across crumbling ruins and desolate forests. But the Lalaurie mansion wasn't just another ghost story. It was the ghost story. A place where history and horror intertwined so deeply that separating the two was impossible. She took a steadying breath and crossed the street. As she drew closer, the mansion's eerie details came into focus. The tall, arched windows were black as ink, reflecting nothing but the faint glow of the streetlights. Wrought iron balconies jutted out like skeletal ribs, their ornate designs rusted and tangled with creeping vines. The front door, a massive slab of oak carved with intricate patterns, bore deep scratches, marks too deliberate to be accidental. The air seemed colder here. The scent of damp earth mingled with something sharper, almost metallic, like blood that had long dried but refused to disappear. At the edge of the property, a wrought iron gate stood ajar, its hinges twisted and corroded with age. Vines snaked through its bars, their tendrils curling like grasping fingers. Charlie hesitated, gripping the strap of her recording bag. Her flashlight dangled at her side, the weight of it suddenly reassuring. When she pushed the gate open, it emitted a low, guttural groan that sent a shiver down her spine. The sound seemed to echo longer than it should have, as though the very air was holding onto the noise. Beyond the gate, a gravel path stretched toward the front steps, each stone glistening faintly in the fog-diffused light. Her sneakers crunched softly as she walked, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. Every step seemed to reverberate, the echoes playing tricks on her ears. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following her, but the street was deserted. As she approached the steps, a sudden breeze brushed past her, cold and sharp. It tugged at her hair and sent a faint whistle through the iron bars behind her. She froze, tilting her head to listen. The wind carried a faint, sour scent, something acrid and decayed, like meat left too long in the sun. Her stomach turned, but she pressed on. The oak door towered before her, its surface scarred with jagged grooves. She ran her fingers over one of the marks, feeling the rough texture beneath her glove. The scratches weren't random, they were deliberate, desperate. Her mind conjured images of nails scraping against the wood, clawing for escape. Her gaze drifted upward to the brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. The metal was tarnished, its surface dull, yet its expression seemed alive, ferocious, judging. Charlie took a steadying breath and reached for it, but before her hand could touch the cold brass, the door creaked open. The sound was slow and drawn out, a hollow groan that seemed to ripple through the stillness. A rush of cold air spilled out from the house, carrying with it a smell of damp wood and something faintly sweet, rotting flowers, maybe, or old varnish. Charlie hesitated at the threshold, gripping her flashlight tightly. The hallway beyond was dim, its edges fading into shadows. Dust motes danced in the pale beam of her light, drifting lazily in the still air. Somewhere deeper inside, she thought she heard a faint sound like the shuffle of footsteps. Her chest tightened, but she forced herself to step inside. The air grew heavier as the door creaked shut behind her, sealing her in. The door closed behind Charlie with an unsettling finality, the echo rippling through the cavernous space. She turned, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the hallway was empty. She swept her flashlight in a slow arc, the beam revealing an opulent yet decayed interior. Faded wallpaper, once vibrant with floral patterns, now peeled away in jagged strips. The wooden floorboards creaked softly under her weight, some warped and uneven as though the house had been buckling in protest against time or something heavier. The hallway stretched ahead, its shadows pooling in corners where the light didn't reach. Doors lined the walls, most of them closed, their surfaces warped with age. Charlie chose the first door on the right and gently pushed it open. The study was small and cluttered, as though someone had left it in a hurry and never returned. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with books whose spines were cracked and faded. A massive desk dominated the room, its surface littered with papers, inkwells, and a small, rusted candelabra. Her flashlight beam landed on a stack of newspapers, their edges curled and yellowed. The top one bore a headline that sent a chill down her spine. Tortures revealed, the night the Lalaurie mansion burned. Charlie set the recorder down on the desk, letting it capture the moment, and carefully unfolded the brittle page. The article described the infamous fire of 1834, detailing how firefighters had discovered the tortured remains of enslaved individuals in the attic. She skimmed the text, her eyes catching on phrases like unspeakable horrors and cries of the damned. She set the paper aside and opened a drawer. Inside, she found a leather-bound journal. Its cover was cracked, the edges scorched as though it had been rescued from flames. Charlie's hands shook as she flipped through the pages, the handwriting frantic and uneven. One entry caught her attention. The cries won't stop. They echo through the walls, even when the house is silent. She says they belong to the past, but I know better. The house holds them here. It feeds on them. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She leaned back, her flashlight catching movement in the corner of the room. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. Nothing. Just the flickering shadows cast by her beam. Charlie picked up her recorder, gripping it tightly as she stepped back into the hallway. The air seemed colder now, the oppressive weight stronger. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she moved toward the grand staircase at the end of the hall. As she passed one of the closed doors, it rattled suddenly, as though something on the other side had thrown itself against it. She froze, her flashlight fixed on the door. Is someone there? The silence was deafening. She reached for the handle, her fingers trembling, but before she could touch it, the door fell still. The house seemed to hold its breath. She took a step back, her pulse racing. A faint whisper drifted through the air, too soft to make out, but unmistakably human. It came from above. The attic. Charlie's stomach twisted. Her research had mentioned the attic, the place where the most horrific discoveries were made after the fire. She didn't want to go up there, but the whisper came again, more urgent this time. Gripping her flashlight and recorder, she made her way to the staircase. The stairs creaked loudly under her weight, each step groaning like a warning. Her flashlight revealed a grand but decayed space. The banister was carved from dark wood, smooth in some places, splintered in others. Portraits lined the walls, their subjects long dead ancestors of the Lalaurie family. Their painted eyes seemed to follow her, glinting faintly in the shifting light. Midway up, she paused. The whisper came again, this time accompanied by a soft sobbing. It was faint, distant, but distinct. Charlie's grip on her flashlight tightened. As she reached the top of the staircase, the air grew colder, biting at her skin. The hallway stretched before her, lined with closed doors. At the far end, a narrow staircase led to the attic. The sobbing grew louder as she approached, the sound twisting into something unnatural. It wasn't just sadness, it was anguish, a guttural wail that made her stomach churn. She hesitated at the foot of the attic stairs. The narrow passage was cloaked in darkness, her flashlight unable to penetrate the void. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. With a deep breath, Charlie placed her foot on the first step. Charlie's foot landed on the first step, the wood bending slightly beneath her weight and letting out a long, groaning creak. The sound echoed in the narrow staircase, the darkness above swallowing the noise as if the house didn't want anyone to hear her approach. She paused, her hand gripping the rail, slick with years of grime. The air here felt even heavier than below, stale and icy, as though the attic were trapped in perpetual winter. Her flashlight beam flickered, and her pulse quickened. She slapped the device lightly, muttering under her breath. "Not now, please." The light steadied, illuminating the narrow staircase ahead. The sobbing sound had stopped. Now, the silence was so complete that Charlie could hear her own heartbeat. Each step up the attic stairs seemed to stretch time, the creaks of the wood growing louder, almost rhythmic, like a drum beat urging her forward. Finally, she reached the top. The attic was a cavernous space, its low ceiling sloping downward at sharp angles. The air smelled thick and sour, a sickening blend of rotting wood, damp fabric, and something metallic that made her throat tighten. Dust hung in the air like a dense fog, swirling around her flashlight's beam. Old trunks and broken furniture were scattered haphazardly, their shapes cloaked in dust-covered sheets that looked eerily like shrouded bodies. A single, cracked window at the far end of the attic allowed a sliver of moonlight to pierce the darkness, illuminating the center of the room. There, bolted to the walls, were rusted chains. Charlie felt her breath hitch. The chains were small, far too small. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to move closer, her sneakers crunching on the debris-strewn floor. She knelt by one of the chains, her flashlight revealing jagged scratch marks on the wooden planks nearby. They were deep, desperate gouges, like someone or something had clawed at the floor in a futile attempt to escape. "Jesus," she whispered, her voice trembling. She aimed her recorder at the marks. Chains bolted to the wall. Scratch marks on the floor. This must be where it happened. Her voice cracked, and she stopped recording. She didn't need to narrate this moment. The silence spoke louder than any words. A faint creak echoed behind her. Charlie spun around, her flashlight darting through the shadows. There was nothing there, just the same piles of forgotten furniture and decaying trunks. Her heart pounded as she stood, gripping the flashlight tightly. "Hello," she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. Silence. Then she heard it. A soft shuffle, like bare feet brushing against the wooden floorboards. The sound came from the far corner of the attic, where the shadows were darkest. Charlie's throat went dry. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her feet refused to move. She aimed her flashlight toward the corner, the beam trembling as her hands shook. The light caught movement. A figure crouched in the shadows. It was impossibly still, its shape indistinct, cloaked in darkness. "Who's there?" Charlie demanded, her voice cracking. The figure didn't respond. Slowly, it began to move not toward her, but upward. It rose to its full height, its outline becoming clearer. It was human-like but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Charlie stumbled back, her flashlight shaking so badly that the light danced across the walls. The figure's face came into view, or rather, the lack of one. Its features were blurred, as though someone had smudged them like wet paint. A low, guttural whisper filled the air, rising and falling in rhythmic bursts. It wasn't speaking, it was breathing, shallow and ragged, the sound scraping against her nerves like nails on a chalkboard. The thing took a step toward her. Charlie bolted. Her feet pounded against the floor as she raced toward the attic stairs, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly. She could hear it behind her, its shuffling steps, its labored breathing. She nearly tripped on the top step but caught herself, descending the staircase 2 steps at a time. The house seemed alive now, its creaks and groans amplifying into a cacophony. Doors rattled on their hinges. The chandelier she'd seen earlier swayed violently, crystals clinking like wind chimes in a storm. As she reached the first floor, the air grew colder, pressing against her like icy hands. Her flashlight flickered again, then died, plunging her into darkness. "No, no, no," she gasped, fumbling with the device as she stumbled toward the front door. It wouldn't open. She pulled harder, her palms slick with sweat, but the door refused to budge. Behind her, the breathing grew louder, closer. She could feel the air shifting, as if the thing were right behind her. Charlie turned, her back pressed against the door. She raised her recorder blindly, her voice trembling. "If anyone finds this, the house." Her words were cut off by a deafening crash. Charlie's breath hitched as the figure stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on invisible strings. The faint light from the window caught its blurred face, the features shifting and warping as though the thing were trying and failing to mimic a human appearance. "You'll never leave it," it repeated, the rasping voice reverberating through the attic like a chilling echo. Charlie scrambled backward, her palms scraping against the splintered floorboards. What do you mean?" she stammered, her voice breaking. "What truth?" The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it raised one elongated arm and pointed toward the far corner of the attic, where the darkness seemed denser, almost alive. As if compelled, Charlie turned her head. At first, she saw nothing, just shadows and dust. Then her eyes adjusted, and she saw it, a trapdoor embedded in the floor, the wood darker than the surrounding planks, as though stained with something long ago. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I'm not going down there." The figure tilted its head, and its raspy voice shifted, becoming softer, almost coaxing. "You came for the truth, didn't you?" Her stomach churned, but she couldn't deny it. She had spent months researching the Lalaurie mansion, obsessing over the rumors of its dark history. Now, here she was, standing on the brink of a revelation that could change everything or destroy her. Against every instinct screaming at her to run, Charlie crawled toward the trapdoor. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the edge, feeling the grooves carved into the wood. They were faint but deliberate, strange symbols, crude and jagged, that seemed to writhe beneath her touch. With a deep breath, she pulled the door open. A rush of cold air escaped, carrying with it the pungent stench of decay. Charlie gagged, covering her mouth with her sleeve. The darkness below was absolute, a void that seemed to swallow the weak beam of moonlight spilling into the attic. The figure loomed behind her now, silent but oppressive. "Go," it rasped. Charlie hesitated, but something in the air seemed to shift, pulling her forward. She lowered herself into the opening, her feet finding a narrow, rotted ladder. Each rung creaked ominously under her weight as she descended into the abyss. The ladder ended abruptly, and Charlie dropped the last few feet onto a dirt floor. The air down here was colder than anywhere else in the house, damp and heavy with the smell of earth and rot. She fumbled for her flashlight, realizing too late that it was gone. Instead, a faint, unnatural glow emanated from the walls themselves. The light pulsed faintly, revealing that the chamber wasn't empty. It was filled with cages. Small, rusted cages lined the walls, each one barely large enough to hold a child. Inside, skeletal remains huddled in unnatural positions, their bones twisted and broken. The dirt beneath them was stained dark, and crude symbols were carved into the metal bars, the same ones she'd seen on the trapdoor. Charlie's stomach lurched, and she stumbled backward, her foot hitting something soft. She spun around to see a pile of rotting burlap sacks. One had spilled open, revealing a mass of tangled hair and what looked like a shriveled hand. "Oh, God," she whispered, bile rising in her throat. "You sought the truth," the voice came again, this time from everywhere and nowhere. "Do you see it now? Do you feel it?" The walls of the chamber seemed to shift, the glow intensifying to reveal crude paintings etched into the dirt. They depicted horrifying scenes, a woman with a cruel smile standing over kneeling figures, a whip in one hand and a scalpel in the other. The enslaved people were bound, tortured, dismembered, their agony immortalized in grotesque detail. Charlie's head pounded as visions flooded her mind. She saw Delphine Lalaurie in her grand parlor, laughing as screams echoed from above. She saw the fire, the panicked crowds, the revelation of the horrors hidden in the attic. And she saw the aftermath, the house standing silent, abandoned but never empty. The glow faded, and Charlie collapsed to her knees, her head spinning. "This isn't real," she muttered, clutching her temples. "This can't be real." When she looked up, the figure was there again, standing in the center of the chamber. But now, it wasn't alone. Shadows began to peel away from the walls, taking shape as figures twisted, broken, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They moved slowly, dragging themselves toward her. Their mouths opened, but no sound came out, only the faint rustle of air escaping ancient lungs. Charlie scrambled to her feet, backing against the wall. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice trembling. The original figure stepped closer, its blurred face shifting into something horrifyingly familiar. It was her. Charlie froze, staring at the distorted version of herself. The figure smiled, its teeth sharp and glinting. "You are part of it now," it said. The shadows surged forward, and Charlie screamed. Charlie stumbled away from the Lalaurie mansion, her mind a blur of confusion and disbelief. The night air was thick and humid, pressing against her skin as she walked down Royal Street, the cobblestones slick beneath her feet. She didn't know how she had gotten outside. One moment, she had been in the attic, surrounded by ghosts and shadows, and the next, she was standing in the street, the house looming dark and still behind her. She stopped at the corner, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her hands were shaking, and the cold, rusted object still clutched tightly in her palm. She opened her hand, staring at it as if seeing it for the first time. It was small, intricate, and old, the metal twisted with age and something darker, as though it had been forged in a forgotten time. Charlie hadn't noticed it before, but now it felt like it belonged to her, as though it had been waiting for her to find it. With trembling fingers, she tucked the key into her jacket pocket, her heart hammering in her chest. It wasn't just the key that disturbed her. It was the way she felt. As she walked, the streets of New Orleans seemed to warp around her. The night was alive with distant sounds, the hum of a passing car, the clink of glasses from an open bar, the chatter of voices. But to Charlie, everything seemed muffled, as though she were underwater. And then, there were the whispers. They had started in the mansion, soft and haunting, and now they followed her. Just on the edge of her hearing, like a distant conversation that was never meant to be overheard. Charlie's hand went to her ear, half expecting to find someone standing behind her. But there was nothing, only the empty, darkened streets. She tried to shake it off. She needed to focus. She needed to get away. She reached for her phone, intending to call a cab, but the screen was cracked, the app she had been using to record her podcast now corrupted and frozen. She pressed the home button again and again, but it refused to respond. Great, she muttered, slipping the useless device back into her pocket. Charlie barely remembered the walk back to her apartment. It was as if the city had turned unfamiliar, the buildings closing in on her, shadows stretching long across the streets. Her legs felt like lead, and each step was a fight to keep moving. When she reached her door, she fumbled with the keys, her hands too shaky to get the right one in the lock. Finally, the door swung open, and she stumbled inside. The air was thick and heavy here, too, but it was nothing compared to the suffocating presence that had filled the Lalaurie mansion. She locked the door behind her, her back pressed against it as she caught her breath. A sudden, frantic knocking on the door made her jump. Charlie stared at the door, her mind racing. Who could it be? She didn't move. The knocking came again, urgent, persistent, as though someone on the other side was desperate to get in. But when she opened the door, no one was there. The hallway outside was empty. Just the quiet, dim-lit corridor, stretching into the gloom of the building. But something was off. Charlie stepped into the hallway, her breath catching in her throat. The air felt different now, thick, pressing against her chest, as if something were waiting. She turned back to her apartment door, and that's when she saw it. On the floor, near the doormat, was a single, delicate feather. It was black, dark as midnight, and had a shimmer to it, as though it reflected light from some unseen source. But there was no light in the hallway. Her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just the feather. It was the sense of being watched. She picked it up carefully, inspecting it for any sign of its origin. As she held it, a wave of cold swept over her, and a deep, ancient whisper filled her ears. It wasn't in the room, it was in her head. You're not free. You belong to it now. The voice was unmistakable, the same raspy, malevolent tone she had heard in the attic. Charlie slammed the door shut and backed into the safety of her apartment. She fumbled with her phone again, trying to get it to work. Nothing. The whispers were louder now, a chorus of voices that seemed to crawl under her skin, vibrating through her body. The feather still sat in her hand, its blackness absorbing all the light around it. In the distance, she could hear the faint echo of footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching her apartment door. Without thinking, Charlie spun around, and her eyes landed on the desk in the corner of the room. It was covered in papers, notebooks, and her podcast equipment. But something had changed. The recorder she had used earlier that night was sitting there, its red light blinking ominously. She reached for it, her heart pounding in her ears. The screen was cracked, just like her phone. But the message displayed on the screen wasn't a glitch. It was a message. You have opened the door. It won't close now. Charlie's breath caught in her throat. She dropped the recorder, the device clattering to the floor. Her hand moved to her pocket, instinctively reaching for the key she had found earlier. It burned in her hand, almost alive, like it was calling her, demanding her attention. And then she knew. The house hadn't let her go. It had chosen her. The knocking on the door grew louder, more insistent. The whispers, no longer just in her mind, filled the apartment, swirling around her. And at the center of it all, the key, heavy in her palm, seemed to pulse with dark energy. The house was waiting. The mansion wasn't done with her. Charlie's phone began to buzz again. But it wasn't a call. It was a message. Come back. You're needed. The house calls you. Charlie couldn't breathe. The shadow that loomed outside her apartment door seemed to stretch forever, dark and unnatural. It moved with purpose, a thick, suffocating presence, as if it was part of the walls, part of the city itself. And that whisper Charlie, echoed through her mind like a constant, maddening hum. With a sudden, frantic movement, Charlie slammed the deadbolt shut, backing away from the door. She reached for her phone once more, but it remained lifeless in her hand, the screen shattered beyond use. The whisper seemed to laugh at her, mocking her helplessness. She was being pulled deeper into something she could barely understand, a world where the boundaries between reality and nightmare were no longer clear. Her eyes snapped to the key in her hand. The metal gleamed faintly in the low light of the apartment. Her fingers brushed against its edges, and a strange warmth spread from the key into her palm, as if it were alive, beckoning. You have opened the door. It won't close now. The message on the recorder still haunted her mind. The key wasn't just a symbol of her connection to the Lalaurie mansion, it was the source of her curse. She had become an unwilling participant in the mansion's twisted history, trapped between the past and present, the living and the dead. Charlie tried to steady her breathing, but the whispers outside her door grew louder, sharper, like a chorus of voices that merged into one. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, run, 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 but her feet felt glued to the floor. Her hands trembled around the key. The more she resisted, the tighter the mansion's grip on her became. She had no choice. She had to face it. The walk to the mansion was not the same as it had been earlier that night. New Orleans felt alien, the streets unfamiliar in ways that twisted her stomach into knots. The buildings around her seemed to lean inward, watching her, their windows reflecting the darkness like blackened mirrors. As Charlie walked, she couldn't help but notice the small things that had started to change. The gas lamps flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The air, once thick with mist, was now strangely still, as though the city had paused to hold its breath. When she reached the mansion, she stood before it for a moment, gathering her strength. The front gates creaked open with a low, mournful groan, and Charlie felt something pull at her chest, urging her inside. She had felt it before, the presence that watched her from the shadows, the house that had a life of its own. The door, like before, swung open with ease, but this time, she knew what awaited her inside. It wasn't just the mansion. It was the curse. The house itself was alive with an ancient hunger, its very walls yearning for something only Charlie could provide. As she stepped over the threshold, the temperature dropped, and the faintest scent of decay filled her nostrils. The darkness was thicker now, suffocating, as if the house were drawing the life from her. Charlie made her way through the mansion, her heart pounding in her chest. The shadows around her seemed to grow thicker, pressing in, curling at the edges of her vision. The whispering had returned, louder now, filling her ears, her thoughts. It was almost impossible to think, the voices crashing together in a relentless, insistent tide. At the foot of the grand staircase, she hesitated. The attic. She knew that was where the key would lead her. The attic was where the truth lay, where the mansion had stored its darkest secrets. But it wasn't just the attic she had to face, it was what awaited her there. Each step creaked beneath her, echoing in the stillness. The higher she went, the more the air seemed to thicken, as though she were walking through a cloud of fear itself. The hallway above felt endless, the door at the end of the hall, the attic door, looming like a dark mouth ready to swallow her whole. She had to open it. She had to face the history she had sought out, even if it meant sacrificing her own sanity. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the same attic, but now it felt different. The air was oppressive, like something was watching her from the shadows. The faint glow from the lantern she had left earlier now flickered in the corner, its light growing dimmer with every passing second. And then she saw it. The trapdoor. It had opened again. Charlie's breath caught in her throat as she approached it, the key burning in her palm, guiding her hand. She reached down to the floor, her fingers trembling as they found the cold metal of the trapdoor's latch. The key slid into place effortlessly, and as it turned, the door groaned open, this time revealing a sight far more horrifying than anything she could have imagined. Below, in the depths of the chamber, something stirred. The chamber beneath the trapdoor wasn't just a place, it was alive. The shadows moved in unnatural ways, writhing and shifting as if they had a mind of their own. At the farthest corner, a figure stood. It was Delphine Lalaurie. But not as Charlie had imagined her, a cruel socialite, a twisted aristocrat. No, this Delphine was something else, something more sinister, more ancient. Her eyes gleamed in the dim light, and her lips twisted into a smile that was both welcoming and horrifying. "You came back," Delphine whispered, her voice as cold as the grave. "And now, you are one of us." Charlie's hands went cold. She could feel the pull of the house, of Delphine's gaze, sinking into her very soul. Her heart raced as she realized that there was no escaping this curse. The mansion had chosen her, and now it would never let her go. The house would consume her, just as it had consumed so many before. The key in her hand seemed to pulse with the same hunger. And then, Delphine spoke again. "You know what must be done. You know the price of the truth." Charlie took a step back, panic flooding her chest. She knew the truth now, the mansion, the horrors hidden inside, the dark past, it was all part of her now. The mansion's hunger wasn't just for bodies. It was for souls, for the ones who dared to uncover its secrets. And Charlie had come too close. She had opened the door. As Delphine's figure moved toward her, the walls of the mansion groaned, and Charlie felt the air shift. The house was ready. Ready to claim its prize. And now it was too late to turn back. Just as Delphine reached out toward Charlie, the entire room shook violently, as though the mansion itself were protesting. The shadows twisted and grew, and the key in Charlie's hand burned with a new intensity. The floor beneath her feet cracked open. A deep, resonating growl shook the walls, and Charlie stumbled forward. She could feel something pulling her down, deeper into the mansion's heart. In that moment, Charlie realized the horrible truth. She wasn't just the victim. She was part of the curse. With a scream, Charlie's vision went black. The darkness was thick, so thick it felt like a physical weight pressing against Charlie's chest. Her mind screamed, but her voice refused to obey. She tried to move, tried to break free, but it was as if she were trapped in a dream, her limbs frozen in place. And then, the shadows around her seemed to shift. The walls groaned with age and sorrow. They whispered to her, not in words, but in feelings, in echoes of long-forgotten pain. She could feel the mansion breathing alive, aware, and hungry. The floor beneath her cracked and split, and Charlie tumbled forward, her body sinking into the darkness. The key was still clutched tightly in her hand, burning with an intense heat that made her fingers numb. She fell into the black void, her heart racing. But as she fell, she wasn't alone. When Charlie's body finally landed with a heavy thud, she gasped for air, feeling as though she had been submerged underwater. She pushed herself up, blinking rapidly against the darkness. The only source of light came from the faintest glimmer in the distance, an eerie, pale glow that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. As she took in her surroundings, she realized with a shock that she was no longer in the mansion's attic. The floor beneath her was no longer wood, it was stone, cold and uneven. The walls were lined with strange, ancient symbols, their meanings lost to time, their edges chipped away by centuries of neglect. And in front of her, standing like a wraith in the dim light, was Madame Lalaurie. Her figure loomed in the shadows, her face pale and drawn, yet her eyes shone with an unnerving vitality. She wasn't the woman Charlie had read about, the aristocrat who had terrorized the enslaved. No, this was something far worse, a twisted reflection of the woman who had lived and died centuries ago. "You've entered my domain," Lalaurie's voice whispered, her tone dripping with ancient power. "You wanted the truth, Charlie. Now you must face it." Charlie staggered back, the weight of her situation crashing down on her. She could hear the whispers now, louder than ever, coming from all directions, as though the mansion itself was speaking to her. The air was thick with the remnants of the past, the horrors, the suffering, the anger of those who had never found peace. "You opened the door," Lalaurie continued, stepping closer. Her voice was no longer sweet, but harsh, her words sharp like broken glass. "You sought to expose me. But the house knows you now. You belong to it, as they all did." Charlie's eyes darted to the walls, the symbols now pulsating with an unnatural rhythm. They were alive, as though they were tied to the house itself. And in that moment, Charlie understood. The mansion was more than just a building. It was a living, breathing entity, its own dark force, sustained by the suffering of its victims, bound by the twisted legacy of Lalaurie's cruelty. The key in her hand throbbed with an insistent pull, like a heartbeat. Charlie looked down at it, her heart hammering in her chest. It was no longer just an object, it was the key to something much darker. It was the anchor, the tether that held her to this cursed place. "The house thrives on souls," Lalaurie continued, her voice barely audible now, carried on the cold wind that swept through the chamber. "It feeds on the pain of the lost, and you have fed it, Charlie. You, like the others before you, are part of it now. And I will make sure you never forget." Charlie staggered back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She couldn't stay here. She had to get out, she had to find a way to escape. But the wall seemed to close in, the very air growing thicker, heavier. She could hear the faintest whispers now, voices that she recognized. The cries of the enslaved, the pleas of those who had been tortured, and the laughter of Lalaurie herself. They were all around her, filling the space, flooding her mind. And then, she heard something else. "Help me." The voice was faint, weak, but unmistakable. It was a plea, a desperate cry for salvation. Charlie's eyes widened as she searched the shadows for its source. The voice had come from somewhere close, but it felt far away. She could feel it, someone was here. Someone who had been forgotten, someone who had been silenced. Without thinking, Charlie followed the voice, her legs moving on their own accord, the key in her hand trembling with every step. Charlie moved through the darkened corridors, her steps quickening as the voice grew clearer, more urgent. She didn't understand. Who could it be? The mansion had been empty when she first arrived. Had she not seen the rooms? But this voice wasn't just in her head, it was real. As she turned a corner, the floor beneath her feet cracked open, revealing a hidden staircase that spiraled downward into the depths of the mansion. The air grew colder, and the whispers intensified as if warning her not to go further. But she couldn't stop herself. The staircase led her down into a dark, subterranean chamber, a cellar forgotten by time, hidden from the world. The air smelled damp, suffocating, and there, in the corner, chained to the stone wall, was a figure. Charlie froze. The figure was barely visible in the gloom, but as her eyes adjusted, she could make out the outline of a person, a woman, hunched and gaunt, her body twisted by years of suffering. Her skin was pale, her eyes wide with terror, and when she spoke, her voice was a rasp, barely audible. "Please, help me." Charlie felt her stomach lurch. This was one of the mansion's victims, a soul bound to the house. The woman's gaze locked onto Charlie's, and for a moment, there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "I am the one who spoke." The woman gasped, her breath coming in jagged sobs. "I've been waiting for someone to break the curse." Charlie's hand clenched around the key. Could this woman be the key to breaking the curse? Had she, too, been a part of Lalaurie's dark rituals? Or was she yet another lost soul caught in the mansion's web of torment? But before Charlie could ask, the ground shook violently beneath her feet, and the mansion seemed to groan in response. The walls were closing in. The key was pulling her closer to the woman, urging her to make a choice: save this soul, or let the mansion claim her too. The whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices urging her to choose. And then, from the shadows, a new voice called out. The price is steep, Charlie. If you choose to save her, you will be lost forever. Charlie's mind reeled as the figure in the shadows moved closer. Lalaurie herself? Or something far worse? The voice was familiar, but it was no longer human. The whispers intensified, becoming a deafening roar as the mansion began to rumble. Charlie's vision blurred, the darkness closing in around her. She had a decision to make, a decision that would alter the course of her life forever. Would she help the trapped soul, and risk her own damnation? Or would she leave the woman behind, sealing her fate with the house that had already claimed so many? And just as the voice of the mansion grew deafening, the key began to glow. Charlie stood frozen, her eyes locked on the trapped woman before her, the dark chamber pulsing with an eerie life of its own. Every fiber of her being screamed to help, to free the poor soul chained to the wall, her desperate, bloodshot eyes imploring Charlie to act. But something far darker was stirring beneath the surface, tugging at the core of her very existence. The key, still clutched tightly in her palm, was humming with an unnatural energy. Save her, and be lost forever. The words echoed in her mind, an impossibly heavy weight pressing against her consciousness. That voice had spoken with a chilling finality, offering no explanation, only a warning. And yet, the woman in front of her was real. The soul chained to the stone wall was real. Her suffering was palpable, hanging thick in the air like smoke, suffocating Charlie with its weight. She could feel it. This was the legacy of Lalaurie, the lingering curse that had never truly ended. It had bled into the house, into the people who had once lived and died here. And now, Charlie was standing at the center of it all, with the power to either break the cycle or become just another lost soul. The woman's voice cracked through Charlie's thoughts. Please. Charlie's heart thundered in her chest. Could she leave this woman behind? Could she truly walk away from someone who had suffered for so long, trapped in a place that had never let her go? And what would that mean for Charlie? Would the curse consume her too? Would she become another shadow in the mansion's dark history, a soul bound by the key in her hand, doomed to never escape? The mansion seemed to grow more alive with every passing second. The walls vibrated as the whispers increased, their voices merging into a deafening crescendo, each one calling to her, demanding her attention. They were angry now, furious at her hesitation. You cannot save them all, a voice hissed from the shadows. Not without paying the price. The shadows around her writhed, as if the mansion itself were alive, feeding off the turmoil that churned inside her. The key in her hand was now unbearably hot, searing into her palm, as if urging her to make a decision. Her fingers twitched, feeling as though the key was alive itself, pressing her forward. Leave her behind, Charlie, the voice continued. It is too late for her. The mansion will consume you both if you try to save her. The curse is unbreakable. Charlie wanted to scream, to shout back, to demand to know why this was happening, but the words wouldn't come. The weight of the mansion's influence was suffocating. Every breath felt like she was drowning in its power. Her vision blurred. The walls closed in, and the shadows seemed to mock her, flickering like flames in the corners of her eyes. Her instincts screamed to run, to escape this nightmare, to put down the key and leave this place behind. But the woman's voice, weak and desperate, shattered that thought. You cannot leave me here. I will not let you. Charlie's chest tightened as the woman's voice quivered with the pain of centuries. She had been here for so long, a part of the mansion's dark history, her soul trapped by the twisted rituals that had bound it to this place. The woman wasn't asking for mercy, she was begging for release. But at what cost? The answer was clear now, even though it had been hidden behind layers of fear and uncertainty. The mansion wasn't just a structure, it was a living, breathing entity, sustained by the pain and suffering of those it trapped. The key in Charlie's hand was the vessel of that curse, the anchor that kept it tethered to the world of the living. As Charlie stared at the woman chained to the wall, she understood. The mansion had fed on the suffering of countless souls. The victims, the ones who had died in its shadow, were not gone. They were bound to it, trapped in an endless cycle of torment. And in this moment, Charlie realized something even more terrifying: the mansion wanted her to become one of them. The key would not release her. It could never release her. If she chose to stay, to break the curse by saving the woman, she would become another lost soul, another part of the mansion's dark history. Her soul would be chained just like the others. But if she left, the woman would remain, her suffering eternal. Charlie's heart raced. Her mind spun with possibilities, with the weight of what would come after. Would she become a prisoner of the mansion, lost forever to its hunger? Or would she leave the woman to suffer, knowing the consequences would be just as dire? Her fingers curled around the key, its heat pulsing against her skin like a living thing. Her body screamed at her to make the right choice, to do what was right. But what was the right choice? The woman, her voice trembling, whispered, "Help me. Please." Charlie's breath caught in her throat. Her gaze flickered between the woman and the shadows that lurked in the corners of the chamber, the mansion's heartbeat pounding louder and louder in her ears. What would happen if she let the key go? Without thinking, Charlie dropped to her knees beside the woman, the key still clutched in her palm. She reached for the chains, the cold metal biting into her skin as she tried to break them apart, desperate to set the woman free. The key pulsed again, and suddenly, everything went quiet. The silence that followed was deafening. The whispers stopped. The mansion itself seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for what would come next. And then, the woman's eyes snapped open. But they weren't the eyes of a tortured soul. They weren't the pleading eyes Charlie had seen before. They were empty. The woman's mouth twisted into a smile, but it wasn't the smile of someone relieved. It was something darker, more sinister. "You should have left," she whispered, her voice cold and hollow. "Now you belong to me." Charlie's heart sank as the woman's form began to distort, her body twisting unnaturally, her skin fading to a sickly gray. Her chains rattled and broke apart, but as they fell to the ground, the woman's body dissolved into shadows, her figure melting into the air like smoke. And Charlie realized too late that the woman was the curse. She had always been part of the mansion's eternal hunger. The mansion's true price was far more horrifying than Charlie had imagined. It wasn't a choice between saving one soul and sacrificing another. The mansion consumed them all. The key had been designed not to release the trapped souls but to trap new ones. And now, Charlie was one of them. As the chamber began to shift and warp around her, the key in Charlie's hand began to pulse wildly. The mansion was drawing her in, its walls closing in, ready to consume her soul. Charlie stumbled back, realizing with a growing dread that she was now bound to the house forever. And worse, the curse was only just beginning. In the distance, she heard a voice, Lalaurie's voice, whispering, "You cannot escape now, Charlie. You are mine." The darkness closed in on her, and the ground beneath her feet cracked open once more. Charlie gasped for air as the walls of the mansion seemed to pulse and shift around her. The shadows that had once whispered now screamed, their voices mingling with the laughter of Madame Lalaurie herself, as if the mansion were alive, watching, waiting. The weight of the key in her hand had never felt more oppressive. It burned like a brand, searing into her skin as though warning her that there was no escape. She stumbled backward, her mind racing to find some semblance of control. The curse had vanished into the shadows, and Charlie was left alone in the cold, subterranean chamber. But the mansion wasn't letting her leave. No, it was drawing her in deeper, pulling her into the very heart of its darkness. Charlie's pulse quickened as she realized the gravity of her situation. She wasn't just a visitor anymore. She had become part of the mansion's twisted history, just another trapped soul bound by the key. The mansion had claimed her, and with every breath, it was closing in tighter. But there had to be a way out. There had to be a way to escape. Charlie's first instinct was to run. She turned, her legs moving before her mind had a chance to catch up. She sprinted through the chamber, the walls closing in, the air thick with the scent of damp stone and rot. Her heart was a drum beat in her chest as she fumbled for the door she had entered through, but when she reached for the handle, she found nothing, just solid stone, as if the door had never existed. No. She slammed her hands against the wall, her breath ragged, panic rising in her throat. The walls of the mansion were closing in, shifting and warping, and the very air seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. The house was responding to her fear, feeding off her desperation, tightening its grip on her. Suddenly, she felt the pull again, the key. It was drawing her deeper into the mansion, towards something she could not yet comprehend. But she could feel it, could sense the dark power that lay hidden beneath the house's decaying exterior. She turned and ran again, her feet pounding against the stone floor, her hands slick with sweat. The hallway twisted before her, and no matter how fast she moved, it seemed as though the mansion was changing, reshaping itself, denying her escape at every turn. "Stop!" she screamed, her voice barely audible in the suffocating silence. "Let me out." But the mansion's answer came not in words, but in an overwhelming sense of no. The shadows thickened, pressing in from every angle. The air grew colder, and a gust of wind swept past her, carrying the faintest scent of blood and decay. She heard something. A whisper. Low. Intentional. "You cannot escape." The voice was familiar. Lalaurie. But this time, it wasn't just her voice, there was something else, something ancient and terrifying, buried deep within the mansion. Charlie's instincts screamed that she had to get out, but every direction she took only seemed to lead her deeper into the maze of hallways. She had no way of knowing how much time had passed since she had entered the mansion. Minutes. Hours. Days. The house was playing tricks on her. The hallways looped back on themselves, the walls seemed to shift and stretch, and even the light seemed to bend unnaturally. In one hallway, the gas lamps flickered, casting long, warped shadows. The floor beneath her feet creaked, groaned, and rattled as if the house itself were alive and angry. And then she heard it. A voice, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. "Charlie." Her heart froze. The sound came from behind her, but when she turned, there was nothing, just more darkness. The mansion was toying with her, pulling her deeper into its nightmarish grip. "Charlie, help us." The voices were soft but persistent, they were real, they were trapped, they were calling for help. Charlie stopped in her tracks. She had heard these voices before, the tortured whispers of those who had died in the mansion's clutches. She had read about them in her research, but now they were here, alive in her mind. The whispers echoed through her skull, disorienting her, forcing her to question what was real and what was the product of her fear. "Please." Charlie clutched her head, falling to her knees as the voices intensified. The cold stone of the hallway seemed to press in on her, the walls narrowing as though the house itself were trying to swallow her whole. And then, she felt it. The pull again. The key was burning, the heat growing unbearable, as if it was drawing her towards something, a room, a door, a final truth. She knew that if she didn't act quickly, the mansion would consume her completely. But where would she go? Every hallway she ran down had led her in circles. The mansion was alive, aware, and it wanted her to stay. Charlie stumbled into a large, open space, an old ballroom, long abandoned. The once beautiful chandeliers now hung crookedly from the ceiling, their crystals shattered and hanging like broken teeth. Dust covered everything: the grand piano in the corner, the faded portraits of aristocratic ancestors, the remnants of what had once been a place of luxury. The air felt thick here, like the weight of centuries of misery had accumulated and settled into every inch of the room. And then, she saw it. A door. It was hidden in the far corner of the room, a door she hadn't noticed before. The key in her hand pulsed violently, as if urging her to approach. Charlie's breath quickened. Was this the way out? The key had been pulling her towards it, but she wasn't sure if this was a chance for escape or yet another trap. The voices still echoed in her mind, and the walls seemed to close in even as she approached the door. She reached out to touch the handle, but as her fingers brushed the cold metal, the world around her seemed to distort. The ballroom melted away, the walls bending in on themselves, and the very air vibrated with an unnatural hum. And then, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Madame Lalaurie. Her ghostly form was even more twisted now, her eyes burning with malevolent fire. She stepped forward, her presence filling the room with a sense of overwhelming dread. You think you can escape? Charlie's heart stopped. There was no running from this, no way out. There is no escape, Lalaurie's voice echoed, a cold, venomous laugh escaping her lips. Not for you, not for anyone. But Charlie didn't have time to dwell on her words. She knew that if she didn't act now, it would be too late. Her mind raced as she thought of all the research she had done, all the stories she had uncovered. The key was the key to everything. It was the mansion's anchor, the force that kept it tethered to the living world. If she could just destroy it. With a final, desperate effort, Charlie raised the key above her head, ready to shatter it against the stone floor. The mansion roared in fury, the walls shaking as if in protest. But just before she could strike, a voice whispered, low and desperate. You don't know what you're doing. The voice that stopped Charlie was faint, yet insistent. It didn't echo like Lalaurie's venomous tones or the tortured whispers that filled the mansion. This voice was different, calm, ancient, layered with a quiet authority. For a moment, it felt as though the oppressive air around her lightened, like a single thread of hope piercing the mansion's suffocating darkness. The key is not what it seems. The voice murmured again. It was neither male nor female, yet its cadence was familiar, resonating with something deep within her. Charlie froze, the key trembling in her hand. Her grip faltered. Her heart raced, torn between the instinct to destroy it and the creeping realization that doing so might unleash consequences she couldn't foresee. If you destroy it, you destroy yourself, the voice continued, softer now, as if it were whispering directly into her soul. But if you wield it, you might uncover the truth. The room around her began to shift again. The once grand ballroom shimmered like a mirage, the chandeliers flickering as though caught between reality and illusion. Lalaurie's form, which had been looming in the shadows, twisted and distorted before vanishing entirely. The mansion was reacting, fighting against the new presence. Charlie gasped, clutching the key tighter. She couldn't tell if the mansion's fury was directed at her, the key, or whatever was speaking to her now. The whispers from the walls grew frantic, overlapping in an incomprehensible cacophony. Show yourself. She shouted into the void, her voice breaking with frustration and fear. The voice responded, steady and unwavering. Then come, Charlie. Come and learn what binds us all. The air stilled. For the first time since she had entered the mansion, the oppressive pull lessened, the shadows retreating slightly. In their absence, a faint golden glow appeared across the ballroom's far wall, outlining the shape of a hidden door. Charlie's pulse quickened. The key in her hand warmed, not burning now, but humming with an almost comforting energy. She hesitated. The door seemed to call to her, but the mansion's previous tricks made her wary. What if this was just another trap, another way for Lalaurie to ensnare her further? You have no choice but to trust me, the voice said. What you seek lies beyond. Charlie steeled herself, crossing the room cautiously. The golden outline grew brighter as she approached, the light almost soothing in contrast to the mansion's usual darkness. She raised the key, its intricate design now glowing faintly in unison with the door. When she pressed it into an invisible lock, the door creaked open, revealing a narrow spiral staircase descending into the unknown. Deeper. Charlie muttered under her breath, her voice trembling. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, but something about the voice, the sense of purpose it carried, drove her forward. She gripped the cold, iron railing and began her descent. The staircase seemed endless, coiling downward like the spine of some ancient beast. The air grew heavier with each step, carrying a metallic tang that made Charlie's stomach churn. Faintly, she could hear whispers again, but these weren't like the disjointed cries that had plagued her earlier. These whispers were rhythmic, almost melodic, like a chant spoken in a language she didn't understand. When she finally reached the bottom, the staircase opened into a vast chamber unlike anything she had seen before. It was an impossible space far larger than the mansion above should have allowed. The walls were lined with shelves filled with crumbling books, ancient artifacts, and jars containing substances that defied explanation. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, its surface engraved with symbols that seemed to writhe and shimmer when she tried to focus on them. Above the altar, suspended in midair, was an orb of swirling light and shadow, pulsating with an almost hypnotic rhythm. The key in her hand pulsed in sync with the orb, as if it were connected to it. What is this place? Charlie whispered, her voice barely audible. The heart of the mansion, the voice replied. The nexus of its power and its curse. As Charlie approached the altar, the voice began to speak, weaving a story that chilled her to her core. Before Lalaurie, before the horrors you've read about, this place was a sanctuary, a place where those with knowledge of the beyond came to study and protect the balance between worlds. The key was their creation, a tool meant to guard against the darkness. Charlie frowned, her fingers tightening around the key. But something went wrong, she guessed. Indeed, the voice confirmed. One of them, driven by greed and the promise of immortality, sought to twist the key's power. They performed a ritual, binding the mansion to their will, but they underestimated the cost. The key did not grant them control, it granted them imprisonment. The darkness they summoned consumed them, binding their souls to the mansion forever. Charlie's stomach turned as the weight of the truth sank in. And Lalaurie? The voice hesitated before answering. She was merely the latest to claim the key, her cruelty amplifying the mansion's hunger. The atrocities she committed strengthened its grip on the world of the living, turning it into the nightmare you know today. Charlie stared at the orb, her mind racing. If the key was tied to the mansion's curse, then destroying it might sever the connection and free the souls trapped within. But the voice had warned her destroying the key might also destroy herself. What happens if I destroy it? She asked, her voice trembling. You end the mansion's reign, the voice replied. But you, bound by the key, will become the final piece of the curse. Your soul will take its place here, ensuring no one else will suffer. And if I don't? The mansion will remain as it is, a beacon for suffering and torment, but you will live free to leave, though haunted by what you allowed to continue. The weight of the choice settled on her shoulders. Sacrifice herself to end the curse, or leave and live with the guilt of abandoning the countless souls still trapped within the mansion's grip. Before Charlie could answer, the orb began to glow brighter, and from within its swirling depths, a figure emerged, a spectral being cloaked in shimmering light. Its features were indistinct, shifting between male and female, old and young. Who are you? Charlie demanded, taking a cautious step back. I was the one who created the key, the figure said, its voice a harmony of regret and resolve. And I am the one who failed to stop this madness. Now, I am but a guardian, watching over the key, waiting for someone brave enough to end what I began. Why me? Charlie whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Why do I have to make this choice? Because you have the strength to do what I could not. The figure extended a hand toward her, and the orb began to pulse violently, as if sensing the decision that loomed. Choose wisely, Charlie. Your choice will determine not just your fate, but the fate of every soul tied to this house. The orb pulsed violently, casting an eerie light across the chamber as Charlie's mind swirled with impossible decisions. The figure before her, half light, half shadow, extended a hand, its voice echoing in her thoughts. The air around her crackled with a static tension that threatened to unravel her. Choose, Charlie, the voice urged again, softer now, but carrying the weight of centuries. There is no turning back from this moment. You must decide what you will become. The weight of the key in her hand had grown unbearable, pressing against her palm with an intensity that felt like a living thing. Her heart beat in sync with its pulsating rhythm. The mansion's oppressive grip, the ghosts of its past, and the looming presence of Madame Lalaurie all seemed to close in on her. She was trapped not just in this house, but between worlds. Charlie's chest tightened, her breath shallow, but she couldn't afford to hesitate. She had come this far, and now, standing at the edge of this unfathomable abyss, there was no turning back. She had learned so much about the mansion, about the cursed key, and about the souls bound to it. But one thing still haunted her: could she bear the consequences of what she might do? Charlie took a steadying breath and looked at the figure before her. It shimmered in the orb's light, as if caught between the past and the present. It felt ancient, old as the house itself, and yet, it seemed to possess a kind of fragile humanity. If I destroy the key, you will end the mansion's curse, the figure confirmed. But in doing so, you will bind yourself to this place. You will become its final guardian, its last prisoner. Charlie's stomach churned. The thought of giving herself over to this nightmare, of becoming just another ghost in the mansion's endless wail of suffering, sent shivers down her spine. But then she thought of the people who had suffered here, those who had never had a choice. And if I leave? She whispered, her voice trembling. You leave the curse to continue, the figure answered. The souls bound to this mansion will remain, and this place will continue to draw those who are foolish enough to come. The pain, the torment, the darkness, they will never end unless you make the right choice. The weight of her decision hung in the air. For a long moment, Charlie stood still, staring at the figure, unsure whether she could take the plunge into the unknown. Could she risk everything for a chance to set things right? Or would she leave, condemning more innocent souls to Lalaurie's twisted legacy? The figure, sensing her hesitation, continued. The mansion will never let you go, not entirely. But if you take the key and use it, you will have the power to rewrite its history, to destroy the cycle. But it will come at a cost. Charlie's hand tightened on the key, the metal cold against her skin. She could feel the pulse of power, the temptation to wield it and be rid of the house once and for all. And then, it came to her, the truth she had been searching for all along. It wasn't just about escaping. It wasn't about leaving the mansion behind. It was about breaking the cycle, severing the connection between the house and the curse, and freeing the souls trapped within. Charlie's eyes narrowed with newfound resolve. I will destroy it, she said, her voice steady despite the fear that churned in her stomach. I will break the cycle. No more will be trapped here. The figure nodded slowly, a look of approval, or was it relief, crossing its ephemeral face. Then the time has come. But remember, once the key is destroyed, you will never leave this place again. Your fate will be sealed here, alongside the mansion's darkness. Charlie's heart slammed against her ribs, but she held the key high. With trembling hands, she brought it down with all the force she could muster. The sound of the key shattering was deafening. It rang out like 1,000 bells tolling, each one a final strike of the hammer against her soul. As the key cracked apart, the mansion seemed to groan in protest. The walls shook violently, the orb's light pulsing in response. Charlie felt herself being yanked backward, as though the mansion itself were trying to pull her into the depths of its curse. But the key had already begun to glow a brilliant, blinding light that consumed the chamber. The air thickened, and the ground trembled beneath her feet as if the very foundation of the mansion was collapsing. Charlie stumbled backward, her hands covering her face to shield herself from the blinding light. The air crackled with power, and for a split second, she thought she saw the faces of the trapped souls flash before her eyes, shadows of pain and torment, desperate for release. Then, the light exploded. When Charlie opened her eyes again, the chamber was eerily quiet. The orb had vanished, and the mansion had stilled, as if it were holding its breath. The walls, once twisted and alive with the mansion's power, had returned to their decayed, lifeless state. She was alone. Her heart pounded in her chest as she took a tentative step forward. The mansion had stopped breathing, its pulse gone, leaving nothing but an unsettling silence in its wake. Had she done it? The whispers, the tormented cries, the overwhelming presence of the mansion, they were all gone. But there was something else, too. Something colder, more unsettling. Charlie. A voice, faint and distant, called out her name, but it wasn't Lalaurie's. It wasn't a ghost. It was hers. She looked down at her hands, the key fragments still clenched between her fingers. Her body was no longer hers. Or was it? The mansion's curse had been broken, but at what cost? The air around her shimmered, and in the distance, she saw the form of Madame Lalaurie, not as a ghost, but as an apparition in the fading light. And behind her, the shadow seemed to twist, as if forming something darker, more dangerous, something that had been waiting for this moment. The curse wasn't gone. It had been transferred.